God forgives those stiff-necked people and honors his covenant with Abraham. And we too know that we worship a God of love and mercy. Just as God takes an active part in easing the Israelites through their liminal living, God does the same for the Philippians, and God will do the same for us. God speaks to us through Paul's words. He gives support and advice that will heal in this time of uncertainty. Paul encourages the people to be of the same mind as Christ. Paul's letter gives the Philippians some action steps, and action is welcome in a time of struggling. Paul couples his action steps with encouraging words. Rejoice, Paul says. Do not worry. Pray with thanksgiving and make your requests known to God. Paul promises God will guide their hearts and minds. They will move forward through their liminal space and into the unity and harmony of the way of Christ. At one time, a contemporary writer named Anne Lamott was particularly despondent about something that was happening in our government. And she asked her Jesuit friend, Tom, how are we going to get through this craziness? And Tom responded, left foot, right foot, left foot, breathe. And he continued, we start by being kind to ourselves. We remember that God is present wherever people suffer. We take care of the suffering, the miserable, the lonely. We ask God to help us, always remembering that God rarely answers our prayers right away. This same God is our God, the God of Moses, the God of Paul, and we worship a living and forgiving God who understands desperation and despair. If we pause for a moment and consider our experiences of living in this liminal space, we can see God's hand throughout this global disaster. Often, it is in the worst of circumstances that we pause in our grief and rest in God's presence and mercy. Even from his prison cell, Paul encourages his followers in Philippi to turn to God in their struggles. Paul promises that the Lord is near, ready to hear their prayers. In the confinement of our own liminal space, we should pause and take Paul's words to heart, and we will know that God stands with us in our threshold. Already, we are finding ways to share God's good news. With technology, we worship together. Church people stay in touch with email, phone calls, interactive study groups. We experience faith abundance in these actions and in our conversations with one another. Paul's action steps for resolving the church's struggles can be ours. He suggests that we be gentle to everyone. Do not worry about anything. Turn to God in prayer, and the peace of God, which passes all understanding, will be ours. And Paul goes on to say, keep on doing the things you have learned, those things that are honorable, just, and true. And sometimes I need to take a lighter look when we're in these kinds of circumstances. And I found a cartoon in a book called The Gospel According to Peanuts. You may be too young to remember it. We see that delightful dog character, Snoopy, dancing, dancing, dancing. His feet are barely touching the ground. Those biggly ears are flying out away from his head. He grabs Lucy up and they spin around and spin around. And he's smiling and he's thinking. To dance is to live. Perhaps a little dancing is what we need right now. Paul, on the other hand, doesn't promise a sudden end to the disharmony within this church. Neither can we expect a sudden and miraculous end to this dreadful pandemic. But we can expect a change in our hearts. We will remain faithful to God. We will live as the disciples God calls us to be. And when we cross that threshold following this pandemic into whatever life that comes, we will be praising God for steadfast love and mercy. We will be thankful for God's encouraging and comforting presence. With joy and thanksgiving, we will no longer be living in liminal space. Amen.